Hey, speaking of comic books, we like to wrap up every episode with a culture recommendation from me. It's the Outshot. It's kind of a cliche now to say that comic books aren't just for kids. Obviously, they're not just for kids. I mean, Art Spiegelman wrote Mouse like 30 years ago. But once you've decided that comics are or can be for grown-ups, then where do you go from there? What's a good landing spot? If you took a set of literature classes in school, but you've never read a comic book without capes in it. Even if you've got a copy of Mouse or Persepolis or Y the Last Man or whatever, how do you process it? Can I recommend a book, a comic, I mean? Get yourself a copy of Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. It is, and I mean this, one of the clearest, smartest, most insightful works of criticism I have ever read. It's a comic book about comic books that assumes you know nothing about comic books, and it is absolutely brilliant. McCloud wrote the book 25 years ago now. And even then, everyone cool knew that comics could be smart and sophisticated and dark and anything else than any other medium could be. But there was almost no one trying to explain the language of comics. I mean, there wasn't even a definition of exactly what comics were. So McCloud went ahead and made one up.
Juxtapose pictorial in other images in deliberate sequence.
That's Scott on my friend Roman's great show, 99% Invisible. If you missed it, he said, juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence. But in the book, the working definition that he uses, the shorter one, is sequential art. That means comic books, but it also means things that came before. Stories told by putting pictures next to each other, from ancient art in caves to papyrus to serial paintings. There were a bunch of examples of sequential art. And then when the printing press came along in the 15th century, things started to look like what we'd recognize as comics.
What's interesting is once you hit print, and this is from 1450, by the way, all of the artifacts of modern comics start to present themselves. Rectilinear panel arrangements, simple line drawings without tone, and a left-to-right reading sequence. And with 100 years, you already start to see word balloons and captions, and it's really just a hop, skip, and a jump from here to here.
That's gotten a TED Talk from a few years ago. In the book, once he's defined his terms and broadly outlined the history, he kind of goes from there. And every time I read Understanding Comics, it's a good hammock book. It only takes a few hours to read. Every time I read Understanding Comics, the insights that he drops almost casually stun me. McCloud talks about our relationship with the icon, the abstracted graphic stand-in, about why a cartoon face is as powerful as, or maybe even more powerful than, a realistic face. As he traces this spectrum from literal and realistic to abstract and cartoony, he also adds other descriptions. The complex, the detailed, feels objective. The simple feels subjective. The detailed and realistic feels more specific. The abstract feels universal. And as you read and watch, you start to feel like you're learning a new language. And then you realize he's only beginning to touch on language. The purest abstraction in a comic book is actual words. So there isn't only one line between real and abstract pictures. There's a triangle, 3 vertices running between reality, language, and the pictorial. And then he hits you with a big one. The central power of comics comes not just from the combination of words and pictures, and actually, as far as McCloud is concerned, something like The Family Circus, which has a picture, one picture, and a caption, is a cartoon, not a comic. The central power of comics doesn't come from that combination. It comes from the gutter, which is the comics word for the space between the panels. So let me explain. If we see, for example, a picture of an axe murderer, and he's got his axe behind his head, he's primed to strike some hapless victim in one panel. And then the next panel, we see the night sky, and there's a scream stretching out across it, right? Written out in letters. Ah! We know what happened in between. Our minds work by understanding patterns, by presuming data points that are between the data points that we can observe directly. That's how film frames become motion inside our brains, and it's also how stories are told in comics, between the frames, in the gutter.
Comics is a kind of call and response in which the artist gives you something to see within the panels and then gives you something to imagine between the panels.
In fact, that is the thing that makes the comics so powerful. The reader, or the looker, or whatever we're called, the reader is the one pulling the weight. The author gives us the moments. We make the story. We see the axe being wielded. We hear the scream, and we are accomplices in the murder. Soon, McCloud is wondering about color and line and about literally what art is and why people make it. But despite the breadth of this work, and it does cover a lot of territory, he's very modest. He's there, guiding us through it all in his lightning bolt t-shirt and his opaque eyeglasses. Just this friendly cartoon telling us an amazing story. A story that's about the possibilities of our stories, because understanding comics starts as an inquiry into reading comics, but it ends as a kind of call to arms for creators. All you need, he says, is the desire to be heard, the will to learn, and the ability to see.
Why is this important? I think this is important because media, all media, provide us a window back into our world. Now, it could be that motion pictures and eventually virtual reality or something equivalent to it, some sort of immersive display, is going to provide us with our most efficient escape from the world that we're in. That's why most people turn to storytelling, is to escape. But media provides us with a window back into the world that we live in.
Actually, that's not quite how it ends. It actually ends with his wife coming into the room and saying to the reader that she has to deal with all this cockamamie theorizing all day, every day. It's, like I said, it's a surprisingly modest book. That's my outshot.